Retirement was supposed to be my reward, the grand prize at the end of a 40-year marathon in a gray, windowless office. I bought my lake house in upstate New York 2 years ago. It wasn't a mansion, but it was beautiful, rich, dark wood, huge windows, and a silence so deep you could hear the wind brushing against the water every morning. I found my peace there, or at least, I thought I had. Right up until the first Saturday of November, I was sitting on the porch, pouring my first cup of coffee for the day, when my son Colin's SUV crunched aggressively up the gravel driveway. Colin wasn't alone. His wife, Tara, stepped out of the car with the posture of a corporate shark walking into a hostile takeover. Tara had always viewed me as a decorative, somewhat inconvenient obstacle in her husband's life. We sat down at the kitchen table. There was no warm small talk, no asking how I'd been. Tara folded her hands over my pine table and dropped the bomb with the casual authority of someone giving an order to an employee. "My parents have hit a bit of a financial rough patch," she stated, staring out the window at the lake. "So, they're going to be moving in here." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a royal decree. Colin sat next to her, his eyes glued to his coffee mug, rubbing the rim with his thumb in that familiar, passive silence he always defaulted to when his wife took the wheel. "This is my home, Tara," I replied. My tone was neutral, deliberate, and I didn't raise my voice a single decibel. "It's just for a few months. Diane. Besides, you have 3 bedrooms. You've got way more space than you need, and they could use the fresh air." She shot back, blowing right past my boundary with a tight, practiced smile. Colin finally looked up. "Mom, it's family. We can't just leave them out on the street." I took my time taking a sip of coffee. At my age, you learn to spot the difference between a genuine crisis and a calculated invasion. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just watched them, noticing how Tara's eyes were already darting around the room, mentally cataloging which of my furniture pieces she was going to throw out. My peace had been shattered, but I absolutely refused to be a victim in my own living room. The following Friday, Tara's parents, Brenda and Gary, showed up with 5 massive suitcases and a stack of moving boxes. They didn't wait for the green light. They just materialized on my porch while I was out watering the begonias. Brenda marched through the front door, dumped her designer purse on my favorite reading chair, and swept her eyes over my living room. Her first words weren't, "Thank you." "Wow, it's very rustic in here. A little dark, don't you think, Gary?" she murmured, pinching my curtains with obvious disdain. Gary grunted something completely unintelligible and dropped the heavy suitcases onto the floor, scuffing the hardwood. I shut off the garden hose, dried my hands, and walked inside, with purpose. "The small bedroom at the end of the hall is empty," I told them, gesturing down the corridor. "It's the only space available," Brenda frowned. "But the bedroom across the hall is so much bigger. It has a view of the lake, and it's mine." I cut in immediately, holding her gaze until she finally looked away. Later that afternoon, while they were busy unpacking and loudly complaining about the lack of closet space, I slipped into my storage closet. A few weeks prior, I'd ordered a small indoor security camera. I originally bought it to point at the backyard to see what kind of critters were eating my plants at night. Instead, I wiped off the lens, plugged it in, and tucked it onto the main bookshelf in the living room, partially hidden behind a tall ceramic vase. I synced it to the app on my phone and checked the angle. It perfectly captured the living room, the entrance to the kitchen, and the audio was crystal clear. I didn't do it out of paranoia. I did it out of sheer instinct. At 68 years old, I've learned that people lie entirely too easily when they think nobody is watching. I wasn't planning on living in a war zone, but I wasn't going to be caught off guard in my own sanctuary, either. The first alert buzzed on my phone much sooner than I expected. By Tuesday, Brenda was already acting like her name was on the deed. The first casualty was my reading chair. I had spent months hunting down that specific leather armchair, and I had it angled perfectly to catch the natural afternoon light. I came downstairs to make some tea and found it shoved against the dark back wall, replaced by a cheap little side table they'd brought with them. The energy flow in here was just terrible, Brenda announced, breezing past me with a mug of my expensive imported tea. I didn't say a word to her. I set my teacup on the kitchen counter, walked over to the living room, and, using my body weight, dragged the heavy leather chair right back to its original spot. I shoved her little table back into the corner. Brenda glared at me from the kitchen, clearly fuming, but she kept her mouth shut. Wednesday, the battleground shifted to the kitchen. I opened the pantry to grab my good olive oil, only to find all my glass jars shoved onto the bottom shelf. At eye level, Brenda had proudly displayed her sugary cereals and instant soups. Without rushing, I grabbed an empty cardboard box, packed up every single item of Brenda's food, and dumped the box on the dining room table. Then, I put my things exactly where they belonged. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Colin. "Mom, Brenda says you're being incredibly hostile. They're just trying to make themselves at home. They are in my home, Colin, and in my home. My things don't get hidden away," I told him calmly. "If they don't like how I organize my pantry, the front door works from the inside, too." I hung up before he could stutter through another excuse on his wife's behalf. I wasn't going to waste my breath debating who was right. Boundaries are enforced by actions, not complaints. I had just settled back into my freshly reclaimed reading chair when my phone screen lit up with a motion notification. The camera had picked up movement in the living room. I opened the app on my phone. The live feed showed Brenda sitting on my sofa, phone pressed to her ear. Gary was out on the porch, completely oblivious. I turned up the volume. The audio was pristine, catching every scheming inflection of my daughter-in-law's mother. She was talking to Tara. "I'm telling you, the old woman is stubborn, but this house is a gold mine," Brenda said, lowering her voice, foolishly believing she had privacy. "If we fix up the yard and knock down that hideous kitchen wall, it would be perfect." There was a brief pause while she listened to Tara on the other end. Then, Brenda dropped the line that changed everything. "We should just move in for good. You guys could come up on the weekends. She's getting old. She doesn't need all this space. She'll be fine if we just stick her in that small back bedroom." I sat perfectly still, staring at the screen. I didn't feel sad. I didn't even feel that paralyzing, deep in your chest disappointment. I just felt an absolute, clarifying coldness. This entire thing had been a coordinated setup. The supposed financial rough patch was just a convenient Trojan horse to invade my property, wear me down, and eventually push me out of my own square footage. Tara didn't want to help her parents. She wanted a free vacation home at the expense of my peace and quiet. I saved the video directly to my phone and backed it up to the cloud. I didn't march into the living room to confront her. I didn't call my son to cry and demand respect. Family drama only gives the other side a chance to play the victim and spin the narrative. I closed the app, grabbed my car keys, and slipped quietly out the back door. I drove 10 miles to the hardware store in town. I had some practical shopping to do before this invasion advanced another inch. I got back to the house 2 hours later, hauling a heavy shopping bag. Brenda and Gary had gone for a walk around the lake. I took full advantage of the empty house. I grabbed my screwdriver and methodically removed the standard doorknobs from the master bedroom and the large guest room, the one Brenda kept eyeing like a vulture. I replaced them both with high-security, heavy-duty, keyed entry locks. It took me less than 40 minutes to secure my territory. I dropped the shiny new keys into my cardigan pocket. When Brenda and Gary finally strolled back in, they found me sitting on the porch, casually reading a novel, right before dinner. I heard the frantic jiggling of a doorknob down the hall. Then, the sound of someone throwing their weight against the wood. "Diane!" Brenda hollered from the hallway. "The door to the big bedroom is stuck and your door won't open either." I walked inside and stopped at the end of the hallway. "They aren't stuck. I changed the locks." Brenda stared at me, her face flushed red with indignation. "Why on earth would you do that?" "I need to get in there to store some suitcases that are taking up space in our room." "Because it's my property." "Brenda, and what isn't being used stays locked," I said, my voice deadpan and void of any emotion. "Your suitcases will fit perfectly under your bed." "This is ridiculous. Tara is going to hear about how you're treating us like intruders," she threatened, crossing her arms defensively. "She can hear whatever you'd like to tell her." I offered a slight smile, one that entirely failed to reach my eyes. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. If you'd like to join me, the table is set." I turned my back on her and walked into the kitchen. I knew the storm was just gathering strength, but my fortress was already built. The weekend brought the inevitable arrival of Colin's SUV in the driveway. This time, Tara practically leaped out of the car, clutching a folder under her arm, radiating an even more aggressive sense of entitlement. Colin mumbled a quick hello before scurrying off to the backyard to find Gary. Tara marched straight into the living room, where Brenda was waiting for her with crossed arms. I stayed at the kitchen island, chopping vegetables. Tara slapped her folder down onto the dining room table and whipped out a fan of paint swatches. "My mom told me you locked the bedrooms." "Diane, that is incredibly inconsiderate." Tara launched in, completely bypassing a greeting. But whatever. I figured I'd make the most of the trip. "I was thinking this cream tone would open up the living room. The colors you have in here are just depressing." She tossed the swatches onto my oak table and pulled a tape measure out of her coat pocket, immediately stepping toward the wall between the window and the fireplace. I dried my hands on a dish towel, walked over to the table, and gathered up the paint swatches. I snapped them shut with a loud thwack. "We aren't painting anything in here." "Tara," she stopped with the tape measure suspended in midair, spinning to face me with a look of exaggerated, condescending patience. "Diane, my parents are going to be living here for a while. They need to feel like this is their space, too. I'm just trying to update your house. You should be thanking me. My house doesn't need updating. And your parents are absolutely not staying here for a while." I shot back, looking her dead in the eye. "They are temporary house guests, though it seems you forgot to brief them on that minor detail." Colin walked in right at that moment, immediately sensing the heavy tension. "Mom, please, don't start. Tara is just trying to help." I didn't yell at my son. I simply walked over to the kitchen drawer, pulled out a notepad, and jotted down a number on the top sheet. I ripped it off and handed it to Colin. "That is your in-laws' proportional share of the electric, water, and grocery bills for this week. It's $180. If they are residents, they pay rent and utilities. If they are guests, they follow my rules." Colin stared at the piece of paper in his hand like it was actively on fire. Tara practically lunged at him, snatching the paper away, and let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You're charging us. You're charging your own family. This is unbelievable." Tara spat, glaring at me with raw contempt. "My parents are going through a crisis, and you, sitting here with your pension and this massive house, have the nerve to ask them for money." "The grocery store doesn't accept family as a form of payment," I replied, leaning back against the counter. "Since they arrived, My water bill has tripled, and a month's worth of groceries vanished in 7 days. I am not running an all-inclusive resort. Brenda chimed in from the sofa, playing the wounded victim. We can't afford to pay that. Diane, you know what our situation is. Then I highly suggest you limit your showers to 5 minutes and stop running my central heating at 80 degrees while leaving the back windows wide open. I informed them. That afternoon, I took things a step further. Since nobody wanted to chip in for the utility bills, I went ahead and locked the door to the laundry room. When Brenda came downstairs the next morning, carrying a heavy basket of dirty clothes, she ran straight into a locked door. She tracked me down on the porch, absolutely furious. I have to wash Gary's clothes, she demanded. The laundromat in town charges $5 a load. It's a 15-minute drive, I told her, without even looking up from my book. The endless complaints quickly made their way back to Tara, who called Colin that night. I could hear him pacing and arguing on the back patio. They were losing their minds because I wasn't cracking under their pressure. They were so used to bullying people until they gave up out of sheer exhaustion. But I wasn't exhausted. I was managing my territory, shutting off their valves one by one. The discomfort was my weapon, and it was working flawlessly. The climax of this little home invasion arrived on the second weekend of December. Tara and Colin came up for dinner. Tara was clearly determined to deliver a final show of force. She sat rigidly at the dining table, totally ignoring the roast I had prepared. Diane, this ends tonight. My parents cannot live like this, like they're prisoners in a boarding house. They need the big bedroom, and they need free reign of the house, Tara demanded, tapping her index finger hard against the table. You are going to give me the keys to those bedrooms right now. Colin nodded weakly beside her. Mom, come on. Enough with the war. Just compromise a little. I looked at all of them. At Brenda with her smug, triumphant smirk. At Gary staring blankly at his plate. At my son, who had completely surrendered his spine. And at my daughter-in-law demanding the keys to my own kingdom. There is no war. Colin, I said, calmly wiping the corners of my mouth with a linen napkin. There's just a massive misunderstanding about your wife's intentions. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. I paired it to the small Bluetooth speaker resting on the dining room sideboard. I didn't say another word. I just opened the app, pulled up the video from 2 weeks ago, and hit play. Brenda's voice rang out, loud and crystal clear across the dining room. We should just move in for good. You guys could come up on the weekends. She's getting old. She doesn't need all this space. She'll be fine if we just stick her in that small back bedroom. The silence that followed was deafening. Brenda went completely pale, practically shrinking into her dining chair. Tara opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Colin slowly turned his head to look at his wife, his face a mask of absolute, deer-in-headlights disbelief. I don't need to compromise. Colin. I finally spoke, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a scalpel. I need to protect my home from a planned takeover. And dinner is over. The next morning, the house was suffocating under a thick, tense silence. Colin and Tara had fought behind closed doors for most of the night before Colin eventually came down to sleep on the sofa. After a deeply uncomfortable breakfast, Tara convinced her parents and Colin to go into town, desperately trying to buy some time to spin a new narrative or find an excuse for what was now undeniable. They pulled out of the driveway at 10 a.m. By 10:05, I had my toolbox sitting by the front door. I didn't need to scream at them to get out. I didn't need a dramatic eviction notice or a reality TV screaming match. I simply unscrewed the deadbolt on the front door and swapped it out For a brand new one I'd bought the same day, I changed the bedroom locks. It took me maybe 15 minutes to completely secure the perimeter. Then, I marched into the back bedroom. I opened the closets and started tossing Brenda and Gary's clothes into their 5 massive suitcases. I didn't break anything, but I certainly didn't bother folding nicely either. I zipped them up, dragged the heavy luggage out the front door, and lined the bags up neatly on the wooden porch. At 1 p.m., I heard Colin's SUV crunch back onto the gravel. I made myself a fresh cup of tea and sat in my leather chair, watching through the large front window. I watched Brenda walk up the porch steps, try to turn her copy of the key, and fail. She tried again. Tara marched up, tried her own key, and when it wouldn't budge, she finally noticed the wall of luggage stacked to her left. Tara started pounding on the heavy wood. "Diane, open this door." I stood up and walked right to the window, fully visible to all of them. I looked them dead in the eye. I didn't unlock the door. I just pointed a finger at their bags, turned my back, and walked away. There was absolutely nothing left to discuss. The message was loud and clear. Access denied. I never opened that door. Tara threw an absolute tantrum on the porch for 20 minutes, but Colin, finally feeling the crushing weight of his own embarrassment, loaded the suitcases into the trunk without saying a single word. He saw my ironclad boundaries and realized that crossing them again would mean crossing a point of no return. They were gone before 2 p.m. The following days were glorious. I put my glass jars back in the pantry, and my reading chair stayed exactly where the afternoon sun hit the pages of my books. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. Guilt is for people who act with malice, not for people who firmly defend themselves. Colin drove up to visit me a month later, alone. He sat on the porch chair, looking exhausted, and offered a sincere apology. I told him I forgave him, but the rules had changed permanently. Tara was no longer welcome on my property without an explicit invitation from me, and the keys to my house would never leave my pocket again. He nodded and accepted it without a fight. He knew the alternative was losing his mother entirely. Sometimes, people mistake the quiet of getting older for weakness. They think a widow's silence is an open invitation to walk in and take whatever they want. But I learned that real strength doesn't require raising your voice or throwing empty threats around. That afternoon, I poured myself a steaming mug of coffee and walked to the edge of the wooden deck. I looked out over the lake as the winter fog began to lift, revealing the crystal-clear water underneath. My house was quiet. It was, in every way, that mattered. Absolutely perfect. And I knew for a fact that no one was ever going to try and measure my walls again. At the end of the day, I learned that true peace isn't about constantly compromising just to keep the peace. It's about having the courage to protect what you've built. Sometimes, out of fear of looking selfish or rocking the family boat, we let people trample right over our red lines until we feel like strangers in our own lives. The greatest strength doesn't require screaming matches, theatrical drama, or exhausting arguments. Usually, all it takes is a quiet, firm action delivered exactly at the right time. Putting up locks, whether they are physical deadbolts or emotional boundaries, isn't an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-respect. Your peace of mind, your time, and your personal space are non-negotiable. And the hard truth is that nobody else is going to defend them for you if you don't take that first step yourself.